Hello, welcome to our webinar on ultra-processed foods, a research and policy conversation brought to you by CFAIR, that's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I'm the CFAIR Program Chair. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I'd like to provide some background on today's topic. Ultra-processed foods, that's UPFs, are more than a buzzword. They are reshaping conversations about diet quality, food affordability, public health, and consumer behavior. Today's March webinar, brought to you by the Council on Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics, invites you to join an engaging and timely session that brings together experts working at the forefront of ultra-processed food research and policy. You will learn about the NOVA food classification system and how it defines ultra-processed foods, what current research tells us about consumer perceptions of the relationship between UPFs and health, and how UPFs compare in terms of price and nutrient density. The session will feature an extended question and answer period this time with the panelists and special guest, Marion Nestle. We have assembled our panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with Nick Rose. Nick Rose, PhD, is an assistant professor at Bastyr University, where he teaches courses in nutrition, research methods, food systems, and cultural perspectives on food. In 2024, Nick completed his PhD from the University of Vermont, where he studied food systems and public health and conducted mixed methods research examining consumer perceptions of ultra-processed foods. In addition to his research and academic work, Nick has over 10 years of experience working as a community nutrition educator, teaching culinary nutrition classes in a wide range of community settings, writing about food and nutrition trends for print and online publications, and advocating for policies supporting healthy, equitable, and sustainable food systems. Brandon R. McFadden is professor and Tyson Endowed Chair in Food Policy Economics in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness at the University of Arkansas. His research offers timely, evidence-based insights into how consumers respond to innovations, disruptions, and policy changes in the food system. Using experimental and behavioral economic methods, he examines how knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions shape food choices, trust in agricultural technologies, and market outcomes. Before joining the University of Arkansas in 2022, he held faculty positions at the University of Delaware and the University of Florida. Marion Nestle is Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Emerita at New York University. In the department she chaired from 1988 to 2023, and from which she retired in September 2017. She's also visiting professor of nutritional sciences at Cornell. She holds honorary degrees from Transylvania University in Kentucky and the Macaulay Honors College of the City University of New York. Before I hand things over to our panelists, I'd like to remind you, the audience, that you can submit questions for the speakers in the chat box at any time. We'll hold an extended Q&A session at the end of the presentation where our panelists will address your questions. So now I'll hand the webinar over to Nick, who will start us off. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today to talk about my research examining consumer strategies for identifying and avoiding ultra-processed foods. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the presentation today. Very excited to share my own research, as I see kind of as featured here on the slide here, which may be the first peer-reviewed study to document U.S. consumers explicitly stating efforts to reduce their ultra-processed food consumption. As I'm going to talk about today in my survey, we found that about a third of survey respondents explicitly reported efforts to reduce their consumption of ultra-processed food. As we're going to see by the end of the presentation, this data was actually collected back in 2022. But we'll get there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and the implications of this research. But first, let's start out by defining our terms and talking about what are ultra-processed foods to kind of help set the stage for this webinar. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So ultra-processed foods are most often defined in research studies using the NOVA classification system, which aims to rank foods based on increasing levels of processing. So as you can see here in this image here, we start on the left with group 1 foods like a whole apple. And then as we move along to group 2 foods, we can talk about processed ingredients that are made from group 1 foods, like maybe apple juice. Group 3 foods are processed foods that might contain a variety of group 1 and group 2 ingredients, maybe like an applesauce that has maybe some sugar and some cinnamon. So we have some multiple ingredients there. And then we could have group 4 all the way to the right there, ultra processed foods. For example, like apple candy, like maybe an apple flavored gummy bear, for example, something that would contain very little, if any, whole foods. There's actually no apples in apple gummy bears, for example. And instead, products like that contain industrial food additives, such as thickeners or emulsifiers or preservatives or flavors. And this is really the hallmark of industrial or ultra-processed foods as defined by the NOVA classification system. And again, this is the NOVA is most often used in research articles for identifying ultra-processed foods. According to Marion Nussel, from one of her papers, ultra-processed foods are unable to be made in home kitchens. That's another way of kind of like thinking about this category of foods. And basically these are multi-ingredient, engineered food products that require little effort to prepare, and so of course they're more convenient for consumers. And as we're going to see, there's been an increasing trend of consumption in recent years. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And if we actually want to talk about ultra-processed food consumption in the US compared to the rest of the world, this graphic here kind of shows that the US is really leading the way in ultra-processed food consumption in terms of we have the highest rates of ultra-processed food intake. It's estimated that more than half of the total calories consumed by adults and children in the US come from ultra-processed foods. And as we can see, there's quite a range around the world of rates of consumption. Some of the countries with, as we can see here, with the lowest consumption of UPF include Mexico and Brazil. However, there have been increasing rates in those countries as well. It's estimated that maybe in Mexico and Brazil, rates have doubled over the last 10 to 20 years. So again, there is a trend of increasing consumption of ultra-processed foods, not just in the US, but also around the world. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we can look more specifically here in the US. So this is data from NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This was published, I think, last year. And again, big picture, US adults are estimated to consume an average of 55% of total calories from ultra-processed foods, and there's even higher rates in children and adolescents, as we can see here. And there does seem to be, not just in the US, but globally, a kind of a linear association between age and ultra-processed food consumption. So again, not just in the US, but around the world, we typically see lower rates in older populations. And then also here in the US, we see lower rates in households with higher annual income. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so, we're eating more ultra-processed food than other countries. Is this a problem, or why is this a problem, or why are we talking about this today? So there are now numerous systematic reviews of observational research. So different types of epidemiological research studies have determined an association between higher rates of ultra-processed food consumption and dozens of diet-related diseases. So as we'll see on the next slide, there's a paper that identified 32 different health parameters ranging from cardiovascular health to mental health to gastrointestinal health. And in some cases, the magnitude of the increases is notable. So for example, a 30 to 40% increased risk for some of the most pressing chronic diseases in the US, including heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And so even the FDA is now started a process to define ultra-processed foods, and it's possible that this could translate to some type of a label in the future. And the FDA is motivated in an attempt to address the growing concerns around ultra-processed food and the current epidemic of diet-related chronic disease that is plaguing America. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which just has a little bit of an overview of some of those outcomes, health parameters that are linked to ultra-processed food consumption. And so this, again, this paper is a good kind of like overview of the different conditions and the level of evidence linking consumption of ultra-processed foods to these different disease states or health parameters. And ultimately, the conclusion from this paper states that the findings from this umbrella review provide a rationale to develop and evaluate the effectiveness of using population-based and public health measures to target and reduce dietary exposure to ultra-processed foods for improved public health. So, you know, there's starting to be more conversation and more interest in kind of supporting the public and reducing their consumption of ultra-processed foods. But while there's a lot of interest there and there's a lot of discussion, there's hardly any research examining the public's understanding of this topic. And so that is the focus of my research. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the study that we published this past year, which examined US consumer knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors related to ultra-processed food. So here, this is kind of a graphical abstract of the study, and where we found this was an online survey of adults living in Vermont. And again, this was conducted back in 2022, which again is a limitation of the study, but I'll come back to that and discuss that later. But we found that about half of survey respondents had heard of the term ultra-processed food. So as we can see here, 48% of people said they had never heard of ultra-processed food, and then 52% were familiar with the term. We also noted that about a third of respondents had not just heard of ultra-processed food, but they said that they were actively making changes to reduce their purchase and consumption of ultra-processed food. And so that was the group that I was really interested in. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide, where I kind of present a conceptual model of the study and the overall study hypothesis. And so, you know, with this study, we were kind of looking at how do people use labels, food labels, when they're evaluating food products in the marketplace. You know, when people are thinking about making healthy food choices, do they look more at the nutrition label, or do they look at like sugar, sodium, saturated fat, and those type of nutrient indicators, which are aligned with the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans? Or do people look at other parts of the label? Do they look at non-nutrient indicators? Maybe look at the list of ingredients to see if they're familiar with home kitchen ingredients, or do they look to assess the extent of processing or consider food production practices, such as the use of genetically modified ingredients? And so these non-nutrient indicators, they're not part of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. However, they are associated with the trend of so-called clean eating, which was the most popular diet in the US during the year of the survey. And so the overall study hypothesis was that those 33% of the survey respondents who said they were avoiding ultra-processed food, the hypothesis was that they're going to be more likely to prioritize these non-nutrient indicators, such as ingredients, processing, and production practices, as opposed to the nutrient indicators. And so let's go to the next slide, where we start to see some of the results and see what happened. Again, the next two slides will have some of the results. And so as we can see here, the study hypothesis was supported, and those who did tell us that they were reducing their consumption of ultra-processed food, they were more likely to prioritize the ingredients list, the extent of processing and production practices. So we can see that, again, they were 61% more likely to look at the list of ingredients, and they were less likely to prioritize each of the different nutrient indicators that were listed there. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we have a little bit of one more follow-up results presentation here. And so this is a list. This is actually how we asked the question. We told people when they're evaluating the healthfulness of different foods in the marketplace, which criteria do you prioritize? So we gave them 7, and people had to pick 3 of the different indicators. So as you can see, the blue ones at the top there were the nutrient indicators, and the green ones were the non-nutrient indicators. And I was showing this to highlight the fact that these non-nutrient indicators were really just as important as many of the nutrient indicators. And in fact, more people prioritize the ingredients than the amount of sodium and saturated fat, which is an interesting finding itself. But also because just almost 80% of respondents selected at least one of the non-nutrient criteria. And so I think one of the main kind of conclusions of this study, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, was that while just a third of respondents told us that they were reporting their efforts to reduce consumption of ultra-processed food, there likely were more people who were avoiding unfamiliar ingredients and highly processed foods, and so they might there's likely even more interest in avoiding ultra processed foods than just the 33% who told us they were explicitly making efforts to reduce their purchase patterns. So again, the study was conducted. Some limitations are that it was in one state, Vermont, and that it was in 2022, which is now becoming a little bit dated. But if we look at kind of more recent data, it does look like there has been an increasing number of people in the U.S. who do report familiarity with the term ultra-processed food. So a 2025 survey found that 40% of U.S. adults were familiar with this term. And then when we look globally, again, there's even higher rates of familiarity with the concept of ultra-processed food in other countries. And so again, the finding that 33% of respondents in Vermont were reducing consumption of ultra-processed foods back in 2022. I would estimate that those rates are potentially even higher today because there's likely more familiarity with the term, and there's been a lot more kind of like media coverage of this in recent years in particular. And then I think on the next slide, I have my final kind of summaries and takeaways. And I'll kind of skip this in the interest of time because I know I want to save time for the rest of our panelists today. And so I'll just kind of conclude with the idea that many people in the US do seem to be concerned with the health implications of ultra-processed food. And so again, there's been some discussion of like labels to potentially, or other educational efforts to kind of support consumers. And I think the findings of this study kind of suggest that labels like that would very likely be well aligned with consumers' frameworks for identifying healthy foods in the marketplace. So thank you so much for your time. I'd just like to acknowledge my collaborators at the University of Vermont, including Jane Kolodinsky, who was on the call with us today. And I look forward to discussing this more later in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nick. I just want to say I'm getting a few messages from the audience that say they cannot see the slides, but there are very many people on this webinar and there are very few comments that say they can't see the slides. So I'm hoping that the slides are now coming through and everyone can see them. Next, we're going to turn to Brandon. Welcome, Brandon.
Thanks, Jane. Hello, everybody. We don't have a lot of time, so let's just jump right in. Next slide, please. And I'll start with the standard disclaimers. Okay, so this has not been peer reviewed. Okay, this is preliminary data. So, please approach with caution. They're subject to change before and during the revision process. It happens. This is in collaboration with EFIC and NIQ. But, the views expressed by me here are all mine, not theirs, not my employers, or the errors. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to present to you today are some results from scanner data. Okay, so we have 52 weeks of scanner data obtained from NIQ, and the data ended in July 2025, the data collection period did. So with this, right, we can, NIQ can link each product's UPC, their Universal Product Code, to an ingredient statement to determine NOVA4 classification. Nick did a great job covering that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but essentially that's what we're going to use here to define something as ultra processed. You can also link that UPC to the nutrition facts label to calculate the nutrient-rich food index. I will discuss that in a few slides to give you some more details about that. Next slide, please. Okay, so this first look, we've got 5 categories of packaged products. We've got cereal, dairy, fruits and vegetables, prepared foods, and snacks. The fruits and vegetables is going to exclude fresh produce. We can't, get an ingredients list or nutrition facts label from those. If you handle retail scanner data, there's also issues with random weights. And then similar story for prepared foods. So we're not including the deli prepared meals here. Also, we're excluding products with sales below 10,000 annually, okay, over that 52-week period. But as you can see, we've got lots of UPCs in each category, ranging from about 2,800 to a little about 15,700. Next slide, please. Okay, so using that product ingredient list, NIQ is able to classify a product as NovaPure or non-NovaPure. And as we can see that NovaPure dominates availability in most of these categories. Okay, so prepared foods 90%, cereal 85%, snacks 74%, dairy 61%. The exception here is the fruits and vegetables category, which is going to include things like dry, canned, frozen fruits and vegetables. We have a lower proportion of NovaPure products in that category. Next slide, please. So this nutrient-rich food index, okay, so what we've done here is we're using the 6.3, which has 6 nutrients to encourage, 3 nutrients to limit. And the way we calculate this is you sum up the daily, the percent daily value for the nutrients to encourage. Here's protein, fiber, calcium, iron, potassium, and vitamin D. And you're then going to subtract, and that's per serving, and you're going to then subtract off the percent daily values for the nutrients to limit. Here, that's added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium. What I've done in this analysis is I cap the percent daily values for nutrients to encourage as at 100%. Okay, for each of those, they can only they max out at 100%, and this is so that a large amount of a single nutrient does not disproportionately, raise that index score up. Okay. However, for those nutrients to limit, they were not capped. Okay, so this will allow for the maximum penalization from those nutrients to limit in this score. Next slide, please. So when we look just across a full category, these full categories, we have the difference in NRF scores here, okay? So the products classified as NOVA minus the non-NovaPure, okay? And I've got 2 sets of results here. So the bars that are shaded in black are, I'm calling the availability results, okay? So this is just what's on the shelves, okay? And then the bars that aren't shaded, that are just showing up white, those results are weighted by purchase frequency. So this is what consumers actually buy at the store. Okay, this is units sold, weighted by units sold. So you can see, on that availability results, on average, NovaPure products have a lower NRF score, ranging from -17 for prepared foods to -5 for cereal. However, there we see some changes when we weight these results by units sold. Okay, and now prepared foods is -19, but cereal in that category is a +5. So the NovaPure products actually have a slightly higher score. Next slide, please. Now these NRF 6.3 scores within a category can range widely. Okay, so what's often done in the literature is you take the NRF scores within a category, right? You sort them by the NRF 6.3 score, and then you separate them into 3 categories, right? So the highest nutrient density category will be those products, the 33% at the top with the highest NRF 6.3 score, and the lowest will be the lowest 33%, right? And then you've got the middle. So we call these, in the literature, these are tertiles, because it's broken into 3 distinct groups. And that's what we're going to do to give another look at these scores. Next slide, please. So when we do this, so looking at the numbers not in the red box, okay, we can see that differences between the NovaPure and non-NovaPure are moderated. The differences are smaller. But then when we look at the highest tertile, which is often a focus in the literature, academic literature, is that NovaPure even starts to perform better at times. And this is just what's on shelf. So this is still availability results. When I showed you that figure previously, NovaPure never performed better than the non-NovaPure in any of the availability results. So this starts to show some nuance. Next slide, please. Now, on the right, I have the difference, percent difference in price, or, the average prices by the tertiles. So you can see that in general, Nova-4 products are less expensive than non-Nova-4 products, ranging from 59% less to 5% more, or rather 6% more rather, in prepared foods. Next slide, please. So, I just showed you the availability results. I did want to show you those results when we weight by unit sold. Pretty similar. Okay, the numbers of NRF 6.3 scores not in that red box aren't moderated as much as when we just look at what's on shelves. But then when we look in the red box for the highest tertile, we see that things like the category like cereal jumps up even a little bit more, and at the same time is about 24% less expensive. So similar results are holding here. Next slide, please. So to conclude, Nova-4 products dominate availability in most of the packaged food categories considered here. On average, Nova-4 products have lower NRF 6.3 scores than the non-Nova-4 products, but these differences narrow when we start to look at tertiles. Nova-4 cereals have the highest nutrient density tertile that outperforms the non-Nova-4. Right, this is likely driven by fortification, and Nova-4 products are consistently less expensive per unit than non-Nova-4 alternatives across nearly all categories and tertiles. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. We're having a few glitches today, and we're not sure whether or not it's people from that are tuning in from secure servers that cannot see the slides. So we're not sure, but we're moving into question and answers now. And I do have several questions queued up. Some of them are more complicated than others. And our panelists are, any one of you can jump in. The first question, and maybe this is an easy one, maybe it's not. What about fermented foods like kimchi? Nick, you had a slide that mentioned South Korean, South Korean consumers and how much they understood about fermented foods. I think about kimchi. Is that a UPF?
No, I'm going to put that in group 3. Yeah, that's going to be a multi-ingredient food made from a combination of group 1 and potentially group 2 foods. Yeah, so yeah, traditional kimchi would certainly be something like a group 3. Now, of course, it is possible that there could be some products out there that might have some preservatives or other ingredients added to it that in theory could bump it up to a group 4 ultra processed food. But I think if we're thinking about maybe a more traditional home prepared recipe, that would certainly fall into group 3.
Yeah, if you can make it in your home kitchen, it's not ultra processed.
Ah, I see. Okay. And the next question is, where does labeling actually fit into this picture? Is it, does labeling scare consumers away? Does it simply inform consumers so that they can make better choices? What are your views on the policy regarding labeling of UPFs?
Marian, do you want to take
you're
this
smiling.
one?
We don't have any labeling of UPF. There are countries that are considering it, but most countries are using the salt, sugar, fat labeling systems, even for warning labels. In Europe, they're using Nutri-Score, and they're talking about adding a UPF designation to the Nutri-Score. But, until we've got labeling, we don't know what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, you were going to say something?
It is interesting that there are, I think there is a group working towards a label. The Non-GMO Project is working on a label. I don't know what their ETA is on that showing up on the shelves, but that'll certainly be an interesting to see the impact of that on consumers' kind of perceptions of food.
Yeah, that would be that's a voluntary system, and the non-GMO project has been enormously successful in labeling GMOs or non-GMOs. I mean, I think they've got 60,000 products in the supermarket that are labeled with that, and it'll be really interesting to see whether their ultra processed works as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think
But it's voluntary.
Yeah.
right. And I think even there too, it brings up like the difference between absence and presence labels, right? Because this would be a non-UPF.
Yeah,
But
I love the no labels.
right.
No GMO, no gluten, no high fructose corn syrup. The lists get longer and longer.
And when it comes to a presence label, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because what classification system are you going to use? What are you going to lean on there? I do think about the prevalence in some categories, right? High proportions. I wonder about unintended consequences there. I wonder what a consumer would think if almost everything on the shelf were labeled, right? Then it has zero communication value. Does it make them think none of this matters? All this is UPF. I could also see, right, if you're even looking within a category and there are a couple of products, does that diminish the role of nutrition, right? So you say, well, they're both UPF. I might as well get the one that tastes better, that doesn't have as much nutrition. So I think there could be unintended consequences that come from this if there's a large proportion of a category label.
Yeah, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has stated that they are not going to regulate anything about food processing. They're going to educate the public about processed foods. So they're going to encourage people not to consume them. But he's backing off on any suggestion that they're going to be labeling them. They asked for a definition. I don't know what they're doing with it or whether they've gotten one. We'll find out.
I've heard him mention a stoplight system as well, but I haven't seen much that way.
Here's a question that piggybacks on to that. What about food safety? Is a food like pasteurization? We don't pasteurize in our home kitchens, and we are seeing outbreaks of things like listeria and so on from raw milk. Are those considered ultra processed foods, and there might be implications for food safety?
No, you could heat up milk in your home kitchen. That doesn't render it ultra processed, and most of the ultra processed foods are dried. They're not, I mean, it would be pretty unusual for them to have food safety risks. We don't see much food safety problem for dried products in boxes. At least I don't. It's the fresh ones that are the problem, and they've just come out and said that most of the outbreaks are due to vegetables now.
That's really interesting. That question came from the audience, but I just learned something.
When you think about milk, low-fat milk products are fortified, and that does bring up an interesting question, because you talked about, Brandon, like within the grains category, many of the cereal products were, healthier based on that nutrient density score, and that's because they were fortified. But that's interesting because that fortification is a characteristic ingredient of UP4, and so that is an interesting.
No.
So fortifying with vitamin D, vitamin A, that would necessarily be viewed as a industrial food additive.
No, the Nova 4 classification specifically excludes nutrients from rendering them. I mean, that's, if you go by the official Brazilian definition, they excluded nutrients from causing foods to be automatically labeled as ultra processed.
Yeah,
I would support that, but it sounded like, Brandon, that was kind of what I heard in your presentation, that fortification bumped certain products into the UPF4 category.
No, but in general, right, ultra processed foods are criticized for being industrial sources of nutrients.
Right. So all of you have mentioned the NOVA classification. We have a question from the audience thinking, what do you think about WISE code? I've never heard of WISE code. How will we come up with a standardized measure of UPFs if policy is going to be promulgated based on them, whether that's voluntary labeling or other policy?
That's what they've asked for. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. sent out a request for comments on the definition of ultra processed, and I don't know what they're going to come up with. They haven't said.
And it is likely that we're likely going to see a lot of euphemisms show up on labels. Even in the new dietary guidelines, they talk about real food, and they talk about avoiding highly processed food. And so I do think that there's a good chance that, in the absence of a one consistent, clearly regulated label, I think we're going to be likely to see more of these kind of like euphemisms for terms that are trying to convey this, this concept that may not necessarily be connected to NOVA or these other systems for identifying UPF.
Well, they specifically excluded NOVA. Because they thought that there was too much debate about it and they didn't want to get into that. At least that's what I was told.
Yeah, I mean,
Brandon, were you going to say something?
I'm sorry?
I was gonna say it's a very complex issue. It's hard to put and particularly like one motivation for the research I just shared was that there's no consideration of nutrition, right? And I understand a concern and wanting people to eat more fruits, fresh fruits and vegetables and whole foods, right? But people have to eat packaged foods at times, and if that's the case, that we know, it would be nice if they were at least nudged towards more nutrient dense options, right? And that's kind of I see the issue with no inclusion of nutrient density in a definition.
That's correct.
Wow. So obviously this is a very complicated issue. And the question is, would you put this into an educational bucket, an addiction bucket, an economic bucket, a health bucket? Like where did all the hullabaloo from UPFs come from in the first place?
Oh, it came from the research. There have been more than 100 studies of ultra-processed foods that link them to a higher prevalence of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancers, anything that's bad that you can think of, and overall mortality. But those are epidemiological observational studies that can demonstrate links, associations, but they can't do causation. And the controlled clinical trials that demonstrate that ultra-processed foods induce people to eat more calories, a lot more calories, as a result of whatever it is, the foods are created to be irresistibly delicious, if not addictive. Those studies were very short duration, and there's a lot of criticism of them. On the other hand, there now been several such studies, and they all point in the same direction, and they all show that they induce people to eat more calories. And that has gotten the people who write about food addictions to do several major studies and reviews. And they're arguing that these products are deliberately formulated to be addictive, largely because these are among the most profitable products in the supermarkets, and the companies are designing them so that people will buy them over and over and over again, dating back to the Lay's chips commercial where he was holding up one and saying you can't eat just one. That's the whole point.
It's just fascinating. I have a long question and a short question here, and I think we have time to get into both. Where do meat alternatives fit into the UPF conversation? That could be cultured meat, it could be Impossible burgers, it could be veggie burgers. Where does protein fit into this conversation?
They're ultra processed. I mean, certainly the plant-based ones are. If they have isolated pea protein and a bunch of other ingredients, and some of which are manufactured, one of which is genetically engineered, and there's no question that they're ultra processed, and the companies that are making them are having a really hard time as a result. uh, because people are questioning them and they don't, I don't know, people really don't want to eat those things very often or very much, or a lot of people don't. And the cell-based meats aren't on the market yet. And it depends on what's in them. I don't know how they're going to be marketed.
I thought there
haven't-
was a chicken that was cell-based
Yeah,
that was.
it may be. I haven't seen its ingredient list. I'm eager to see it.
Anyone else want to comment on that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting controversy. I was just going to say, just because, yes, I think, historically people see terms like plant-based and that gives a product kind of like a health halo. And I think historically people have thought about anytime we're moving away from animal products, that's like a positive, change for our health. But this is more, now we're seeing more recently that it's not quite that simple. And so like products with like, these multi-ingredient, Beyond Meat products would absolutely be classified as ultra processed. And I think people are starting to kind of like question that logic of like plant-based as like automatically being, superior as a result of this evidence.
Yeah, and I think it just further highlights like how complicated all this is, right? I mean, this is a confliction. An animal scientist is going to argue the most highest quality source of protein is animal meat, right? And then, so if you want people to eat less meat, they're probably going to have to move to a processed industrial source of it.
Plant
Well, I mean,
sources of protein.
yeah.
Francis Moore Laffey said in 1971 that you could combine plant proteins and they would be just as good as wheat proteins.
Right, but still not the highest quality.
If you mix them together, they're just as good.
Diet for a Small Planet. I remember
Right.
that book.
Diet for a small planet, rice and beans, 1971. Still in print.
So I'm going to move into, everybody listen very carefully. This is a long one, but it's an interesting one. At the heart of the ultra-processed framework is an implicit ideal, the home kitchen, scratch cooking, food made by hand from recognizable ingredients. Does this language help translate science into behavior, or does it smuggle a set of class-coded assumptions about cooking and domesticity into public health in ways that ultimately work against the people most affected by diet-related disease? Wow.
Good. Good question. All right, I'll go. Yeah, of course it does. If you're going to advise people to do home cooking, and if the basic premise of the dietary guidelines is to eat real food and reduce intake of highly processed foods, you got to give people the money in order to buy what are going to be more expensive foods. You also have to account for the convenience factor in ultra processed foods. And if somebody's working 3 jobs, they're not going to want to go shopping. And if they don't have a kitchen, if they don't have pots and pans, if they don't know how to cook, if they don't have time to cook, you have to give them the resources in order to be able to do these things. And what was really interesting to me about the dietary guidelines was they explicitly excluded equity considerations from anything having to do with the guidelines. They said all of the previous guidelines were based on equity. We're not going to do anything about that. We're going to stick strictly to the science without in any way accounting for the reality of the lives of a great many people in the United States. And so I think your question is very well taken.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And but also the time piece, right? Like you're saying, the time piece, I think is huge. If I overweight my own observation, we don't have a lot of packaged foods in the pantry, but that's because we have the time to spend an hour and a half preparing, cleaning up dinner, or we have the income to go out, outsource that to food away from home at a sit-down restaurant, right? So that convenience piece that's added, the affordability piece, we don't need much in our household. We also don't have a bunch of young kids going to soccer practice or an aging parent in the household, right? So we have a lot of time. But it's funny, I was thinking about this when I again, overweighting my own observation, thinking about like the processed foods that are in my pantry that we eat a lot. Tortillas, which we use as a vehicle for nutrient dense foods.
They're not ultra processed.
Well, we're getting the ones with, anyway. And then the protein waffle mix with protein, right? High protein waffle mix. So the waffle is starting to be made in 5 minutes after I've started. Now, what's interesting, I started thinking about is, I use that as a vehicle for minimally processed peanut butter and maple syrup, which I also need to limit my consumption of, right? So I'm glad we're talking about this. I'm glad these discussions are more prevalent. But it's just so complex, and how people interact with them. I think we're moving towards more of a discussion of overall nutrient intake and how somebody has to diversify that through the use of different products.
This next question, and we're getting near the end. What does the research say about the physiological mechanisms that connect UPFs to negative health impacts? Marion, you mentioned associations, but not causation. Is it because they're higher in salt and higher in sugar and higher in stabilizers? Are those the mechanisms, or we don't know, or it's higher in calories maybe? I don't know. But the question is, what are the physiological mechanisms that the research is pointing to?
Yeah, I don't think anybody really knows yet, and it's under active investigation. But the one thing we absolutely know, at least from these short-term studies, is that they induce people to eat more calories. And 75% of American adults are overweight or obese. And that's calories. Nobody ever talks about calories except me. It's people overeat calories. Diets, there's a lot more leeway in diets if you're not overeating calories. You have to make sure you're eating enough of healthy foods in order to get your nutrients. But there's room in healthy diets for ultra processed foods. I certainly have my favorites, and I just try not to eat too much of them. As a dietary principle, the one fundamental principle of nutrition is to eat a wide variety of foods, as unprocessed as possible. But a wide variety of minimally processed foods, that takes care of it.
Everything in moderation. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Any closing comments? Oh, something just came up. New question.
I was going to follow up, Jane. I was just going to follow up on that question about kind of like the sodium and sugar thing. You're absolutely right that UPF for ultra processed foods are much more likely to have higher levels of sodium and sugar. However, those observational studies often are able to control for those factors, and there remains an association even after controlling for those. So it does seem to be, a lot of people think it's kind of it is something beyond just those components. But I do tell my students that really is kind of the billion-dollar question right now. Really, the mechanism linking UPF with chronic diseases is really kind of a question that has not really been fully answered. And it's limiting the research, I think, from moving forward. Absolutely.
Before we move on to closing out this webinar, any last thoughts? I'm getting lots of comments from the audience thanking you for this conversation. And it's clearly very complicated. Any thoughts you want to leave us with about UPFs?
Yeah, I'd like to say I don't find it all that complicated. I really don't. In fact, the principle of healthy diets are so simple that Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And as long as you define food as not being too heavily processed, that takes care of it. The big issue is cooking. Learn how to cook. It's really fun.
I guess,
oh, go ahead.
Well, for closing thoughts, I was just going to say that one thing that I do think this is an exciting time for the science of nutrition, and I do think that this concept, as I kind of mentioned, is nicely aligned with many consumers' understanding and perceptions of food and the relationship between food and health. And so I'm actually excited to see kind of where this goes in terms of whether it's a label or educational efforts or other efforts. And I think again, ultimately, this could be information that many consumers are looking for. And so yeah, it'll be exciting to see where we go with future policies and hopefully labels.
I think a lot of consumers intend to eat better than they do, including myself. And right, and that doesn't always, intentions don't always lead to actions. And so I think it's, you know, the focus needs to be on closing that intention action gap.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question for healthy eating for a really long time, hasn't it been? It's like we want to do it, but how do we make those behavioral changes? And maybe perhaps making it easier at the supermarket or wherever it is that you buy your food might be the way to go. Fewer processed foods on the shelves mean fewer ultra processed foods that people will buy. I don't know. So maybe it does start with education and the conversations that we're having. So I want to thank the panelists. I have a few things that I have to say to close us out. Immediately following this webinar, you'll be sent a follow-up survey. Your feedback is really, really important to us because we like to provide monthly webinars that serve the needs of our audience. And before we wrap up, we encourage you who enjoyed this webinar to sign up for our newsletter at cfare.org. That's CFARE.org. And a recording of this webinar will be available on that website in the coming days. So for those of you who couldn't see the slides, you can click on cfare.org in a few days and you'll be able to see the slides that went along with the conversation. We also have a podcast series called Get a Grip on FARE, and you can find us by searching our name, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics, on a variety of platforms. I'd like to give a word of thanks to our partner. This and other CFARE programming wouldn't be made possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, AAEA. And I want to really leave us with a big thanks to our panelists and thank you to our audience. I know that it's hard to give up an hour of your day to come and listen to us and participate, but we really do appreciate it. So thanks so much and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.